Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some pretty mind-bending neuroscience today. You guys sent in György Buzsáki's The Brain from Inside Out. And honestly, just that title alone, The Brain from Inside Out, had me hooked.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to try to unpack Buzsáki's unique perspective and uncover some surprising, maybe even counterintuitive insights about how our brains actually work. So are you ready to challenge some common assumptions about the brain?
Absolutely. You know what I find so fascinating about Buzsáki is how he really pushes us to question the very language we use in neuroscience. He kicks off the book with this anecdote about, the scientist philosopher from his childhood, someone who on the surface seemed to know everything, but whose explanations always left young Buzsáki feeling kind of more confused than enlightened. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that feeling, especially when you're wrestling with complex scientific jargon, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, and Buzsáki makes this really interesting point about how a lot of the terms we use today in neuroscience, like emotion, attention, even representation, these terms actually originated way before we had any real understanding of the brain. It's kind of like trying to explain the internet using vocabulary from like the telegraph era,
So we're setting ourselves up to ask the wrong questions from the start.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because our language really does shape our thinking, right? So if we're stuck using these outdated terms, it can kind of lead us down the wrong path. And I think that's what Buzsáki is getting at with this inside-out framework he's proposing. It really flips the script on how we traditionally approach neuroscience.
Oh, yeah. And you know what else I found really interesting? Buzsáki's take on all these big brain projects that everyone's talking about. I was kind of surprised to read his critique, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because none of them seem to actually prioritize understanding the fundamental principles of how the brain works.
Well, yeah, discovering those core principles, those kind of foundational insights, it takes a long time, decades even. And let's face it, neuroscience is still a relatively young field. We're kind of like explorers mapping this vast, uncharted territory. We have some amazing tools at our disposal, but we're still trying to figure out the basic lay of the land. And the danger is that we end up with mountains of data, but very little actual understanding. It's like having a state-of-the-art telescope, but not knowing which direction to point it.
Right, that makes total sense. It's like when you're reading a dense research paper.
Yeah.
You're overwhelmed by all the details, but you can't quite grasp the core message. Buzsáki actually addresses this challenge in the book, right?
He does, yeah.
He makes this point that scientists, unlike professional writers, aren't always the best at distilling complex ideas into something that's clear and simple to understand.
There's definitely a tension there between being accurate and being accessible, right? But making scientific knowledge, understandable to a wider audience, that's crucial. And Buzsáki really emphasizes that. He advocates for this inside-out approach, which is kind of a direct challenge to that traditional perception-action model that's dominated neuroscience for so long.
Okay, this is where things start to get really visual and exciting. In Figure 1.2, Buzsáki contrasts the outside-in and inside-out approaches. It's kind of like comparing a photograph to its negative, the traditional outside-in view. It focuses on how the brain reacts to a stimulus, like, say, a flower. But the inside-out perspective, it emphasizes how the brain actually interacts with the world to understand that flower.
So think of it this way. Neurons, they don't actually see the world. All they receive are signals, right? So how do they actually make sense of those signals? Through action. The brain actively probes its environment. It makes predictions and then tests those predictions against the feedback it receives. It's like a constant dialogue between the brain and the world.
So instead of just like sitting there passively waiting for information, the brain is actively seeking it out and actually shaping its own perception.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
It really is. And a key part of this whole process is something called corollary discharge. Essentially, it's a copy of the brain's own motor commands. And this copy gets sent to the sensory systems. It's kind of like the brain is saying, hey, heads up, I'm about to do something, so don't be surprised by the sensory feedback that's coming in.
That's fascinating. Buzsáki uses this great example to explain corollary discharge. Have you ever noticed how your own voice sounds different to you than it does on a recording?
Oh, yeah.
That's corollary discharge at work. Your brain is anticipating the sound of your own voice, and it's adjusting your perception accordingly.
Like having a built-in sound engineer.
Exactly.
And this mechanism isn't limited to just hearing. It's happening across all our senses. It helps us differentiate between the actions we initiate and the things that are happening around us. Think about touch. You can feel your hand moving across a surface, but you don't feel that same sensation of touch if someone else moves your hand for you.
It's amazing to think about how much our brains are filtering and shaping our perception of reality all the time. This whole idea of active sensing is really intriguing. Buzsáki gives the example of, I think it's a spider, that actually moves its sensors around to gather information about its environment. So it's not just passively waiting for information to come in, it's actively going out and getting it.
Exactly. And even our own sense of smell is a great example. When we sniff, we're not just passively inhaling odors, we're actively drawing them in and creating turbulence in our noses, which actually helps us detect and discriminate between different smells more effectively. It's like our brain is saying, hey, let's go hunt for some information.
So our brains are basically orchestrating this whole symphony of perception with our senses as the instruments.
I love that analogy. It really highlights how intertwined perception and action truly are. Two sides of the same coin, really. And this leads us to another key concept in Buzsáki's framework. Cell assemblies. These are groups of interconnected neurons that, fire together, wire together. They're like the building blocks of complex actions and thoughts.
So instead of individual neurons acting alone, they work together in these coordinated groups, kind of like a team.
Exactly.
That's cool.
It's this coordinated activity of cell assemblies that allows us to perceive, think, and act in the world. And through repeated activation, those connections between the neurons, they become stronger. And that's how learning and memory happen, essentially. Buzsáki really challenges that traditional view of the brain as this passive recipient of information. He argues that it's constantly generating its own internal models of the world, and it's testing those models through action.
It's kind of a radical paradigm shift, right?
It is.
And it has huge implications for how we understand everything.
Yeah.
From, basic perception to complex decision-making. To illustrate this idea of internal models, Buzsáki uses a really clever analogy. A map versus a list of directions. Maps are way more efficient for navigating complex environments, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And just like a map, the brain creates these internal maps to represent the world around us.
Our brains construct these incredible representations of space and time, drawing on information from our senses, our movements, all of it. And those maps aren't limited to just physical space. They extend to mental spaces as well, things like memory and social interaction. Think about how you can vividly recall a childhood memory. Or imagine a future event. Those are mental spaces that your brain has constructed.
It's wild to think that our brains are constantly creating these internal models,
Yeah.
even when we're not consciously aware of it. And these models are always being updated and refined through experience, right?
Precisely. It's a process Buzsáki calls internalization. And through internalization, we build this increasingly richer understanding of the world and our place in it. But it's not just about physical spares, as we were saying. We also construct internal models of social relationships, emotions, abstract concepts.
This leads us to a really fascinating aspect of social cognition. Mirror neurons. These are neurons that fire both when we perform an action ourselves and when we observe someone else doing that same action. It's almost like our brains are mirroring the actions of others, which allows us to understand their intentions and emotions.
Mirror neurons are thought to play a crucial role in things like empathy, social learning, even language development. Imagine trying to learn a new skill just by reading a book. It would be way easier if you could watch someone else do it first, right? That's mirror neurons in action, helping us learn through observation.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love how Buzsáki ties this into the importance of codes. He tells this great story about learning Morse code and emphasizes the challenge and also the wonder of understanding codes. And then he connects that to the brain's own need for a kind of cipher to interpret the meaning of neural activity.
It's like our brains are speaking their own language, right? And we're just beginning to decipher it. Just as Morse code uses dots and dashes to represent letters and words, our brains use patterns of neural activity to represent thoughts, feelings, actions. And one of the keys to cracking this code, to understanding the brain's language, is to shift our perspective from outside in to inside out.
So instead of thinking of the brain as passively receiving information from the world,
Right.
we need to view it as actively constructing its own reality.
It's a pretty radical shift in thinking.
Yeah.
But it opens up a whole new way of understanding how our brains work. If our brains are constantly predicting and shaping our perception, how much of what we experience is really a reflection of the external world, and how much is a product of our own internal models?
Whoa, that's a big question.
It is. It's a question worth pondering. Yeah, it really gets to the heart of what Buzsáki is arguing. He suggests that instead of just passively absorbing information, the brain actually creates. It generates its own internal models of the world. It's kind of like having this block of marble, like a sculptor's block, but Instead of being totally blank, it already has these rough outlines of potential sculptures just waiting to be revealed.
So instead of being just a passive receiver, our brains are more like these active sculptors, shaping and refining those pre-existing patterns based on our experiences. That's a really cool analogy.
It highlights how our brains aren't just blank slates when we're born, right?
Right.
We come pre-wired with this set of possibilities, shaped by, millions of years of evolution and our own individual developmental journey. Think of a newborn animal. It's not totally helpless. It has reflexes, it has instincts that guide its early interactions with the world.
Like a baby bird instinctively opening its beak for food, even though it's never been fed before.
Exactly. Those instincts, they reflect these pre-existing neural circuits that have been honed over, countless generations. Buzsáki suggests that these patterns are kind of like the grammar of the brain, the framework for learning and adapting to our environment.
So our brains come with this set of rules for making sense of the world. And our experiences, they help us refine those rules, apply them to new situations. It's kind of like learning a new language,
Yeah.
At first, you might rely heavily on a dictionary and grammar rules. But as you become more fluent, things become more intuitive.
Yeah, and that intuition. It reflects the internalization of those rules, right? They become embedded in our neural circuitry, which brings us back to these internal models. They're not just these static representations. They're dynamic, generative, always predicting what's going to happen next.
So it's not just about reacting to the present, it's about anticipating the future. Our brains are like prediction machines, always trying to stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly, and that predictive power is crucial for survival. Imagine trying to catch a ball. If you only reacted to its current position, you'd always be a step behind. But by predicting where it's going to be, you have a much better chance of catching it. And this applies to more than just physical actions. It shapes our thoughts, our emotions, our social interactions, everything.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that our internal models, they actually affect how we relate to other people.
Absolutely. Buzsáki talks about how our brains are constantly generating these expectations about how others will behave. And those expectations, they influence our own actions and reactions. Like we're all working with these internal scripts for how social interactions should play out. And when those scripts get violated, we can feel really thrown off.
I guess that explains why social situations can sometimes feel so complex and unpredictable. We're all trying to figure each other out while simultaneously acting out our own internal scripts. Buzsáki also talks about the role of emotions in this whole predictive process, right? It's not something I would have necessarily connected to internal models before reading this.
He suggests that emotions are kind of like these action programs that evolve to help us deal with recurring challenges. Think about fear. It's an unpleasant emotion for sure, but it's also incredibly useful. It motivates us to avoid danger, protect ourselves.
So emotions aren't just these random feelings. They're actually a crucial part of how our brains make sense of the world and guide our actions. That's a really helpful way to think about it.
Yeah, they're deeply intertwined with our internal models. When our predictions are wrong, we often experience these negative emotions, frustration, disappointment, those kinds of things. But when our predictions are confirmed, we feel those positive emotions like joy or satisfaction.
It's like our brains are giving us constant feedback on how well our internal models are working. But for those models to be effective, they need to be grounded in reality, right?
Absolutely. It's not enough to just run simulations in our heads. We need to test those models in the real world. And that's where action comes in. By interacting with our environment, we gather feedback that helps us refine our internal models. It's like a scientist testing a hypothesis. You might have this brilliant idea, but you don't know for sure if it's true until you conduct an experiment.
So action isn't just a consequence of thought. It's an essential part of the thinking process itself. We're not just passive observers, we're active participants in shaping our own reality.
That's a great way to put it. And it's this active engagement that allows our brains to learn and adapt. There's another interesting point that Buzsáki makes about the relationship between space and time. I think you'll find this fascinating.
Yeah, I'm all ears.
He suggests that our brains, they don't perceive space and time as these separate, distinct entities, but rather as these interwoven aspects of a unified experience. You can't really have one without the other. Our brains use all sorts of cues to construct these internal representations of space and time, drawing on information from our senses or movements.
That makes me think about how our perception of distance can be affected by how long it takes to travel that distance. Like if it takes forever to walk a short distance, we might perceive that distance as being longer than it actually is.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly integrating information about both space and time to create our subjective experience of the world. It's another great example of how our perception of reality is this incredible construction, shaped by our brain's internal models. This brings us back to that inside-out perspective, right? It's not just about reacting to stimuli, it's about actively generating our own reality.
I'm starting to get a real sense of the power of this framework. It really challenges a lot of our assumptions about how our brains work. But if we're always generating these internal models, how does the brain ever disconnect from the external world?
That's where disengagement comes in. It's the brain's ability to kind of disconnect from the immediate environment and manipulate its internal models. Think about daydreaming or planning for the future. We're not directly interacting with our surroundings in those moments, but our brains are still actively generating thoughts and ideas.
So our brains are more than just these input-output machines. They're capable of creating their own internal worlds. And that ability is crucial for things like, creativity, problem solving, even our sense of self.
Exactly. And all of this happens through this incredibly complex communication and cooperation between different brain regions. Buzsáki actually uses this analogy of the brain as a society of neurons to emphasize how important communication and cooperation are within the brain.
That makes sense. Just like a society needs effective communication networks to function, so does brain.
Right, and that communication happens through all sorts of mechanisms. Electrical signals, chemical messengers, even physical changes in the brain structure. Buzsáki highlights the role of brain rhythms in coordinating activity across these different brain regions. Things like alpha waves associated with relaxation or theta waves linked to memory formation.
It's like the brain is its own internal orchestra, with different instruments playing together to create this unified experience.
Love that analogy, yeah. And those rhythms, they're not fixed. They're constantly changing in response to internal and external cues, reflecting the dynamic nature of brain activity. Another crucial aspect of brain function is feedback loops. Buzsáki uses the example of how the brain regulates its own activity levels, making sure things don't get too chaotic or too quiet.
So even when we're not consciously thinking, our brains are still hard at work keeping everything in balance.
Absolutely. So with all this complexity, how do we even measure something like intelligence? Buzsáki challenges that traditional view of intelligence as this single quantifiable trait. He argues that it's this multifaceted concept, not easily captured by a single test.
Yeah, it seems like that kind of limited view of intelligence, it would definitely fall short. There's so many different types of intelligence, right?
Exactly. Buzsáki suggests that intelligence is better understood as the brain's ability to adapt to its environment, solve problems, learn from experience. It's not just about how much you know, but how effectively you use that knowledge. And that effectiveness, it's shaped by so many factors, genetics, environment, even our personal motivations.
It's kind of like, the difference between being book smart and street smart. People can excel in different areas and have different ways of applying their knowledge.
Exactly. Buzsáki also emphasizes the importance of diversity in brain function. He argues that there's no one ideal brain. Different brains specialize in different tasks. Some people are brilliant artists, others are gifted mathematicians, others are natural athletes.
It's that diversity that makes humanity so interesting, right? We all have our unique strengths and perspectives.
Exactly. And Buzsáki suggests that this diversity is essential for our species' survival. It allows us to adapt to a wide range of challenges and thrive in different environments. It's not about everyone being the same. It's about embracing our differences and recognizing the unique contributions that each person brings to the table.
That's a powerful message, especially in a world that often seems to prioritize conformity over individuality. But with all that we're learning about the brain, it still feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Absolutely. Buzsáki concludes by encouraging us to embrace the mystery of the brain. We've made incredible progress in understanding how it works, but there's still so much that we don't know.
It's like we're explorers charting a new continent. And with each new discovery, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and wonder of the human brain.
Exactly, and that journey of discovery. It's something we can all participate in by asking questions, challenging assumptions, embracing new ideas. We all contribute to our understanding of this amazing organ. It's a reminder that science isn't just about memorizing facts, right? It's about curiosity, creativity, the joy of exploration.
That's beautifully put. It's about keeping that childlike sense of wonder alive, even as we delve into these complex scientific concepts.
Exactly. And that spirit of exploration, that's what drives us to keep asking questions, seeking answers, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Buzsáki leaves us with this very thought-provoking question. If our brains are constantly generating their own internal models of the world, what does that actually mean for our perception of reality?
That is a deep question. It really makes you wonder. How much of what we experience is truly an objective reflection of the world out there? And how much is shaped by our own internal filters, our own biases, our own expectations?
It's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And now neuroscientists are exploring it in all these new and exciting ways. It really highlights how the brain isn't just this passive receiver of information. It's this active architect shaping and constructing its own unique reality.
And that reality is influenced by everything, right? Our genes, our experiences, our thoughts, our beliefs. It's kind of a humbling realization.
It is humbling, but it's also kind of empowering in a way, isn't it? Like, by understanding how our brains work, we can actually gain more control over our perceptions, our thoughts, our behaviors. It's like we're taking back the reins of our own reality.
Exactly. And that actually leads to another really interesting point that Buzsáki makes about how our understanding of the world, it's really a collaborative effort. It's the result of countless minds working together over time. We build upon the knowledge and insights of those who came before us, just like we're doing now with Buzsáki's work. Right?
Yeah, it's this constant, back and forth, this collective effort. Exactly, and that network of knowledge, it's constantly expanding, too, thanks to our ability to, to externalize our thoughts through language, writing, technology, all of it. Buzsáki actually uses a really surprising example to illustrate this point: clocks.
Clocks, huh? I wouldn't have thought of those as being so central to our understanding of the world.
But it's amazing how something as seemingly simple as a clock can have such a profound impact on our lives and on our collective understanding of time even. Clocks allow us to coordinate our actions, plan for the future, build these complex societies. They synchronize our activities, create this shared sense of time.
Now that you mention it, yeah, it's hard to imagine modern life without clocks. They're everywhere. But I guess there's a downside too.
It is, yeah. As clocks become more precise, more ubiquitous, they can also become kind of, tyrannical. They dictate our schedules, create this sense of urgency that can be really stressful, even harmful. It's like we've become slaves to time, constantly racing against the clock.
Well, I think we've all felt that pressure at some point in our lives.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a good reminder that we need to be mindful of the tools we create and how they shape our lives, both individually and collectively.
Exactly. Buzsáki encourages us to find that balance, between the demands of this external world, shaped by things like clocks and schedules, and the needs of our own internal worlds, where creativity, reflection, daydreaming, all those things reside.
So it's not about rejecting technology or progress, but about using it in a way that actually enhances our lives rather than diminishing them. I can definitely get behind that message.
Me too. And it brings us back to this idea of the brain as an active architect of reality, right? We have the power to choose how we engage with the world and what kind of reality we create for ourselves.
It's about recognizing that agency we have,
Yeah.
That we're not just passive recipients of information. We have a role to play in shaping our own experiences.
Exactly. And Buzsáki concludes by emphasizing the importance of embracing uncertainty. He reminds us that science is a process of continuous discovery, right? We should never be afraid to question our assumptions or explore new ideas, even if they seem a little bit out there.
That's really what drives scientific progress, isn't it? That curiosity, that open-mindedness. And it's something we can all cultivate in our own lives, I think, no matter what we do.
Absolutely. Buzsáki's book is really a call to action, in a way. It's urging us to become active participants in this ongoing exploration of the brain. It's an invitation to join this community of curious minds, all striving to understand this most complex and mysterious organ. And it's a reminder that the journey of discovery is just as important as the destination.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Buzsáki's The Brain from Inside Out, let's just take a moment to appreciate the incredible power and potential of our own brains, to be grateful for this gift of consciousness, this ability to experience the world and try to make sense of it all.
And let's never stop exploring, questioning, marveling at the wonders of the human mind.
You asked for a concise summary of the key insights from the brain from inside out. So here's our 10-point takeaway list based on Buzsáki's Inside Out framework.
Number 1, the brain operates from the inside out. It's not just passively reacting to the world, it's actively generating its own internal models and testing them against reality.
Number 2, a lot of the common terms we use in neuroscience, they actually came from pre-scientific thinking, and they might be limiting our understanding. It's like trying to explain a smartphone using the language of telegraphs.
Number 3, the brain doesn't just passively perceive things, it actively interacts with the world to make sense of it. Think about active sensing, like when we sniff to enhance our sense of smell. We're not just passively inhaling odors, we're actively engaging with our environment to gather information.
Number 4, cell assemblies. Those groups of neurons that fire together, wire together, they're kind of like the words in the brain's language, the building blocks for all those complex actions and thoughts.
Number 5, just like a self-driving car uses SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping to navigate, our brains construct these incredible internal maps of space and time, using information from our senses and our movements.
Number 6, and this internalized experience, it's not just about physical space. It extends to mental spaces as well, like memory and social interaction, which suggests that there might be a common mechanism for how we navigate both the real world and our imagined worlds.
Number 7, mirror neurons highlight this incredible ability our brains have to understand the actions, the intentions, even the emotions of others. It's like the biological basis for empathy and social understanding.
Number 8, just like Morse code uses dots and dashes to communicate, our brains use their own kind of code, these patterns of neural activity, to represent and interpret information.
Number 9, Buzsáki challenges that traditional outside-in framework where the brain is seen as this passive receiver. Instead, he proposes that it's more about actively generating internal models, making predictions, and testing those predictions through action. It's a continuous cycle of learning and adaptation.
And number 10, the brain's internal organization, where some neurons and connections are much stronger than others. This actually shapes our subjective experience. It influences everything from how we perceive the world to how we make decisions. Think of it as like a good enough brain that acts fast based on those most active neurons, and then a more precise but slower brain that requires more time and effort.
So those are our 10 key takeaways from The Brain from Inside Out. A glimpse into Buzsáki's Inside Out framework, a way to rethink how our brains really work.
It's a perspective that has huge implications for understanding, well, pretty much everything about how we experience the world, from perception and creativity to our very sense of self.
We encourage you to explore Buzsáki's book further and keep delving into the amazing world of neuroscience.
And remember, the brain is this dynamic, ever-evolving organ. The journey of understanding it is an ongoing adventure.
Keep asking questions, challenging assumptions, and embracing the wonder of the human mind.
Until next time, happy exploring.
Yeah.